They came in with the tide, quiet as a winter snowfall, the river's black face disturbed only by the slow dip of oars and the whisper of reeds rubbing along the hulls. There were no lanterns. Stars burned in a high, cloudless sky, and the moon was a white coin hammered thin. The black water tasted of salt and ash, and beneath it slept old things, rotted pilings and ships' ribs and chains and the bones of men. The little skiff at the front slid into a shadow so near to the mud gate that the oarsman could have reached out and touched the stone with his blade. The fat man crouched in the bow breathed as if he had learned to breathe without sound. He was not dressed for the night, too bright even cloaked, but he knew the city's veins the way a man knows the lines of his own palm. He pressed a gloved hand to the wet stone and closed his eyes as though listening. "There," he murmured, "3 rings of iron. The innermost is stiff, and the outermost grates. Mind the middle, it sticks." A giant of a man with a thick beard and a nose battered flat grunted softly. "We mind the gate. You mind your tongue, Great John." Another voice said behind them, low and steady, a voice that had no business out here where the stink of night soil and tanneries crawled from the water. "Let him work." The fat man smiled as if no one could see it. He set his fingers into ancient grooves and pulled. Iron sang, rust screamed, and then with a careful patience that struck the bearded giant as a kind of witchcraft, the postern gate's bolts inched back inside the wall. On the third boat, Robb Stark stood with his hand in Grey Wind's ruff and felt the wolf's heartbeat like a drum against his bones. The river was everywhere, smell and hush and the oily sheen where night met stone. Behind him, Brynden Tully's profile was a cut of granite against stars. The Blackfish had not spoken since they left the cove beyond the towers of the city's wall, but his calm had steadied the men more than any prayer. Once inside, Robb whispered, "We split as planned. The Mormonts to the river gate, Umber, Blackwood with me to the Red Keep. Theon Greyjoy's grin showed white in the dark. The watch houses on the wharf. We take the bells before they sound." Robb nodded. He could feel the weight of the north trailing him like a shadow with teeth. He had not marched with drums. He had not brought trumpets and banners and all the bright madness that warlords love. He had brought 1,000 picked men, hard and lean, and a promise kept between them that if they died this night, it would be for something that would outlive them. The inner bolt quivered loose, and the postern gate sighed as it opened into a slot of deeper dark. The fat man drew back at once and pressed himself to the wall to make room for the wolves from the cold. Robb smelled hot tar and old stone, rat, sweat, and iron. Somewhere beyond the gate a man coughed in his sleep. They poured in shadow to shadow. Grey Wind slid ahead, gray on gray, and the dooryard's 2 drowsing gold cloaks did not stir until the wolf's teeth were sunk in one man's throat and the other's mouth filled with Umber's hand as if with a gag of fur. A knife pricked that one side. He chose to sleep through it. A third man, taking his piss against the inner wall, turned with a drunken smile and found himself staring down the shaft of an arrow nocked to a longbow carved with a blackbird, Tyto's Blackwood's son, all quiet focus and the kind of cruelty that only comes to gentle men in necessary moments. By the time the watchhouse door creaked open and the sleepy sergeant leaned out with a "Hello then" on his lips, the Mormont women were already through him with their short spears, and the door stayed open on its hinges with him slumped across the sill like a sack of barley. Robb went first across the yard, Brynden at his shoulder, Theon a half-step behind with a coil of tarred rope. A torch hissed as it hit water. Feet whispered. The city beyond the mud gate breathed and did not yet know it was being taken. Robb heard, as if from a great distance, the whisper of sails as Wyman Manderly's ships ghosted up to the quays under bare masts, and the hair along his arms rose at the thought of men climbing those ropes even now, coming up out of the sea like the drowned returned. He wanted his sisters. He thought the words without shame. He had a crown tucked like a knife under his every thought these days, a weight he could feel even as he slid through the postern. But the crown was for the north and for the fathers buried in crypts with stone wolves at their feet. The city was a means and a message both. He had said as much to his mother, and Catelyn Stark had looked at him a long while with tully blue eyes that had watched a river for 50 years and said, "If you must take it clean." The alley beyond the gate stank of fish guts and old wine. They moved fast, and then faster to keep from thinking. A dog barked and got quiet when gray wind's shape passed like a winter wind. The first bell on the far hill had not yet rung when Daisy Mormont's women took the river gate from the inside. They had climbed the inner stairs in felt-soled boots and left the gatekeepers in their beds with their mouths closed by hands that knew how to hush babies and men both. Daisy blew the whistle she had hidden in her hair, and the manderly oars groaned like an old tree as ships kissed keys. On a tower stair up from the wharf, Theon Greyjoy slid a knife between a man's ribs and felt it scrape on the far side. A bad angle. He had never loved the smell that came after, copper and hot meat. But this night it was part of the river's breath and the city's stench, and his own name whispered in his skull. Greyjoy. Stock. The blade came free. The man folded like wet sail. Theon kicked him back into shadow and bounded up the last steps 2 at a time to the bell house. The bellringer was an old man with milk mustaches of hair. He reached instinctively for the rope when the door blew in. Theon's knife took the rope instead, slicing it above the knot in a quick black hiss. "Quiet," he said as he caught the old man's wrist. "For a little, then wring it until your teeth rattle. But not yet." "What in the? We're not the ones you fear," he said. It was almost true. He left the bellman bound with his own rope and went to the window slit. Below, the river yard roiled with shadows as more men came up out of boats. He could smell White Harbor even from here, pitch and fish and the tang of salt washed clean, and felt the hook of home tug at him as surely as anything. He grinned to himself without mirth, because it was a crooked joke that the only thing that smelled like his birth isle was the work of a man who bent the knee to Stark. On the street of steel, a boy woke to the sound of many boots and thought at first it was only a fever dream. His father had left for the city watch and not returned for 3 nights, and his mother had burned her hands on their little brazier lighting a candle for safety. The boy crept to the window and saw a woman with a bear stitched on her shoulder pad take a man through the leg and then the throat with the same clean, unfussy motion. He watched a big gray wolf pass beneath him, fluid as smoke, and he knew no prayer to make for that. He made one anyway, up on Aegon's high hill, where the Red Keep squatted like a sleeping dragon with its wings tucked. Sansa Stark woke to the sound of nothing. The city, for all its noise, had its own night rhythms. The distant song, the quarrels in the alleys, the bells, the sea-smack laughter from the wharves, and she knew them better than she had ever wished to. She sat up in her narrow bed and pressed her hands to her stomach. The room was black. No moon came through the shutters. She could hear her handmaid's rough breathing on the pallet by the door and the smaller, wheezing sleep of the little maid, Chael, near the hearth. There should have been a lantern burning low in the corridor. There was not. When she opened the shutters, the dark had teeth. Far below in the city, something moved that was not the usual slow pulse of the night. She could not name it at once. It felt like the moment in a song when the strings draw tight and someone draws in a shared breath before the words change. She dressed without lighting a candle, hands moving in practiced quiet. She had learned quiet as she had learned courtesy, as a way to make herself small inside walls that did not love her. She let the maid sleep. She could not say why. On the far side of the keep, the hound had been awake since evenfall. Sleep did not come easily to Sandor Clegane now, if it ever had. The walls around him were full of the scratchings of small men with smaller knives, and his dreams were all fire. He had sat with his back to the chamber's cold hearth and drunk until the bottle was empty and then sat some more. When silence fell over the keep like a blanket, he scowled at it as if it were some fool come to make sport. He belted his sword and went to see what the gods had seen fit to do with the night. At the top of the Tower of the Hand, Tyrion Lannister also woke to the wrong kind of quiet. He knew the city's all-night arguments like lines from an old farce, and he had trained himself, in the weeks since he had been made hand, to sleep through stampede and whisper both. But silence like this was not silence. It was a hand on a mouth. He rolled from bed, found his wine flagon by its neck, took a swallow that did not help at all, and limped to the window. His scar itched. Bronn snored softly on the pallet by the door in the way of men who can sleep only when they are too tired to do otherwise. In the dark above the river, a bell did not ring. "Up," Tyrion said, and Bronn was on his feet with a dagger in his hand before his eyes were even fully open. "What hour?" "The hour when I regret being alive," Tyrion said. "Listen." Bronn stood very still. The city breathed with its mouth closed. "Hells," he said without inflection. "Gold cloaks," Tyrion rasped. "Now." In the courtyard below, the first of the wolves met the first of the lion's household knights. The clash had a sharpness to it that woke men from dead sleep. A dozen lanterns flared as doors opened. A man called to another man, and then steel slid from scabbard, and then someone cried a wordless sound that might have been mother or murder. Robb Stark stepped into the lantern light with gray wind at his hip and did not feel young. They cut their way to the inner gate of the Red Keep with knives and whispers and a length of chain thrown around a winch drum. Mormont women held the corridor to their right with squared shields and low thrusts whenever gold glinted at the edge of their vision. Brynden Tully had 4 men with him and moved as if he had been designed by a patient god for the work of taking a castle in the dark. He had said nothing yet, but his eyes were alive in the lamplight. A boy with freckles and a Riverlands lilt was killed by an arrow from above, and Robb saw it and said nothing and stepped over him in the next breath because that is what he had taught himself to do. He felt it anyway in the bones that would not stop being 19. The inner gatehouse door had 3 heavy locks. The fat man slid out from nowhere with a ring of keys in his hand that none of them had given him. "This, your grace," he said soft as dust, "is the hinge on which very many things will turn." Robb did not ask him his name. He had asked before and been given a dozen different ones in a dozen rooms. Robb only watched the man's hands, and the locks turned like tired hounds. By the time the first bell finally did ring, wild and sudden, as if someone had found one last rope with a desperate hand, it was too late for what bells were good for. They peeled across a city already bending in a new direction. Men rushed towards the sound and ran past faces they did not know and names they would never learn. A gold cloak came around a corner and did not see the Umber's fist until his chin met it. He slept without waking. Sansa was on the gallery overlooking the Queen's ballroom when the bell went mad. She saw Lord Varys flitting down the corridor below like a pale moth and thought, absurdly, of lemon cakes. He looked up once and saw her and put a finger to his lips, smiling. She did not smile back. She followed him at a distance through a little door she would never have seen if he had not gone through it. Down a narrow stair that smelled of dust and old linen, through another door whose key hung on a rusted nail, and out onto a landing that took her into a small, dark pantry at the end of a corridor she knew. Varys was gone by then as if he had been imagined. Sansa stepped into the corridor. 2 knights in Lannister crimson came clanking around the corner at a trot that was almost a run. They looked at her without seeing her, faces pale and set, and kept going. She heard a woman's voice raised in a scream and went colder than she had been in months. "Little bird." She turned so fast she almost fell, and he steadied her with one large, scarred hand. Sandor Clegane's hair was unbound. His mouth was set like a scar that had learned to speak. He looked her up and down and snorted softly in disgust that was not aimed at her. "You are dressed." "Yes." She hated how breathless she sounded. "Good." He listened for a heartbeat. "You're going to your brother." Sansa's hands moved of their own accord to her throat, where the little silver chain lay hidden under her shift. She had not let herself think his name in so long that hearing it spoken in another's mouth was like sunlight through shutters. "Is he here?" Clegane's mouth made a crooked shape that might have been a smile in someone else. "If he isn't, a lot of men have come a long way to die for nothing. Keep close, little bird. There's going to be mess." Cersei Lannister watched from the high gallery of Maegor's Holdfast as her house knights formed a line in the inner yard. She had her boys with her. Tommen was chubby with sleep and confused, and Joffrey was raw-nerved and bright-eyed with a kind of hunger that made her love him with a fierceness that ate up her reason. She had a small vial in her sleeve that clinked against her wrist when she moved too quickly. Pycelle fussed at her elbow like an anxious wet nurse. She had sent for the Kingsguard. They had sent back excuses. Her mouth tasted of orange blossoms and fear. "They came out of the river." the chamberlain gasped, as though this were a story four peasants had made around a fire. The gate. Cersei's gaze cut him in two. I can see the gate. Find me Ser Marin. Find me Ser Boros. Find me men who have not pissed themselves and put a sword in their hands. And fetch my brother. Prince. Not that one, she snapped. The other. He fled. You must retreat into Maegor's Holdfast, Pycelle wheezed. The causeway can be lifted, with enough food, and wait to be holed out like a fox? I have starved in gilded rooms before. Cersei shook her head once, cleanly. No, the vial rolled coolly under her fingers. Her father would come if he decided the coming served him better than the waiting. If he had not already moved. If this was not his own design, which she did not believe only because she would have had to go mad if she did. Joffrey laughed. Let them come. I will give the wolf's head to Sansa on a pike. Be still, she said, and he was so used to the tone that he obeyed before he understood he had. She placed her hand against his cheek, felt the heat of him. Listen to me. If anything happens... Tyrion came into the yard with Bronn and a half-dozen sellswords at his back and the knowledge, mordant and clear, that there was no good version of the next hour. He smelled the river on the air and something else underneath it that made his mouth go dry. A sweet, oil-tinged reek that was as old as a king who had burned and as dangerous as the man who had burned him. He found Jacelyn Bywater in the press and gathered him in with a jerking nod. How many men will stand? Tyrion asked. As many as are paid, the new commander of the watch said grimly. And as many as believe they'll see their wives come morning. That many, then, Tyrion said. Hold the inner yard. If they take the gates to Maegor's, we raise the causeway and let them gnaw themselves on the walls like dogs. But if you can keep them off the keep itself, if I can keep them off the keep itself, we will be the stuff of songs. Songs are for the dead, Bronn offered. I like silver better. Live then, Tyrion said mildly. We'll count coin in the morning. He had no illusions about stopping what was coming. He had not built the chains yet. The pyromancers had been busy but not yet productive. His sister had made 100 poor choices and then picked a handful of worse ones to stack atop them. But he was still himself. He could buy time. And sometimes time was all that a man like him needed to turn a knife by a finger's width. They hit the inner yard like sleet, 6 dozen men with northern sigils ghosting along their sleeves and a gray wolf running with them like a thought. The first rank of household knights broke immediately. Gold armor had a way of weighing a man down just when he had to run. The second rank held, some of them, and made a hedge of steel good enough to make the wolves slow. Morrigan, Kettleblack, a Celtigar or two roped into city duty, a Heatherspoon with a broken nose and stubbornness. Boros Blunt's sword wavered in his hand. He did not run. Meryn Trant's mouth was a tight little line. He did. Robb Stark led from the front because there was no other way to lead this kind of war. He never raised his voice above a speaking tone, because shouting wasted breath and made fear travel. He let Grey Wine choose his lunges and did not deny the wolf any flesh he took. In the far corner of the yard, a woman in silk stood very straight with a boy played at being a king beside her, and Robb saw them without letting his eyes settle. He reached the foot of the steps and found a man with a boiled leather vest and a Lannister red scarf barring his way with a pike. It had been a long time since Robb had trained in the yard at Winterfell with Ser Roderick shouting in his ear and his father watching with half a smile. He remembered both too clearly in the moment that followed. He stepped to the pikes outside, caught the shaft, twisted, and shoved his blade under the man's arm to the place where breath goes in and out. When the man screamed, he pulled the blade free and took another step. The scream followed him. He did not look back. Jacelyn, Tyrion called, and the thunder-throated old knight moved to block the stair. There he stood like a gate ironed to bone, his pike planted, his men around him in a wedge. Stark! Tyrion yelled then, and it was the only way he knew to be heard over the yard's sudden churning. If you want the city, you will not get it by making a river of blood. Parley. Robb Stark turned his head. His eyes were the cold of deep wells. He took 3 more steps, stopped 10 feet below Tyrion, and looked up. You have my sister, he said. Parley at once. That same moment Sandor Clegane brought Sansa out of a side passage into the upper gallery. The sight of her brother hit her like wind after a long fever. She had dreamed him too many nights with a sword in his hand and wolves on either side. And now here he was real, with gray on him like a winter sky and blood spattering white fur. Sansa did not know that she screamed until she realized the sound in the air had come from her mouth. Joffrey's head snapped AR. Ound. Cersei laid a hand on his arm, and for once he did not shrug her off. Robb! Sansa cried, and Sandor's hand closed on her arm hard enough to bruise as he dragged her back behind the balustrade. Robb had already seen her. In his face nothing changed. He did not look at Joffrey. He did not look at his mother's enemy. He looked at Tyrion Lannister, who in that instant looked more tired than anyone had a right to look and more clever than anyone had a right to be. Parley? Robb repeated, and Tyrion motioned with 2 fingers. The wedge of watchmen shifted, opened like the mouth of some iron fish, and in the new space that was made a handful of words could live where iron had been expected. They spoke on the steps with bodies all around and the city gnashing its teeth. Tyrion began because he would die by morning if nothing was done, and he hated dying inconveniently. This is the Red Keep. You cannot have it by storm without burning your sister where she stands, and you did not come here to do that. Stand your men down to the yard, and I will stand mine to the walls. None of us wants a slaughter. I want my sister freed, Robb said. Now, and safe. Send for her. Your Grace, Tyrion said, and it was not mockery. If I call for her, every fool with a grudge will take it upon himself to intercept. The safest way is for her to come down under guard into this yard when we are ready for it. A man cried out around the corner and was quiet in the next breath. Robb's head tilted to it. Your gold cloaks will throw down their spears, he said without turning his eyes from Tyrion. We came by river and by postern. We hold the mud gate and the river gate. The wharves are ours. The bells are ours. Your men can die here for nothing or live to walk out of this place and be ashamed later. Better to be ashamed than dead, Bronn observed. Tyrion ignored him. Your Grace, Robb. It is not my wish to see blood spilled. Some of these men will fight because they must prove to themselves they are not cowards. Others will run because they know they are. But if you cut them all down, you will leave the city without a watch for a day, and that day will feed on your men like rats on a drowned horse. Stand them down, let them live, and you keep order. And you live to scheme, Robb said. Always, Tyrion agreed mildly. There is nothing noble in dying when you don't have to. Your father knew that. The name hit like a hand. Across the yard, Cersei's face tightened. Joffrey shifted as if he had understood nothing and everything at once. On the gallery, Sansa pressed a knuckle between her teeth. Sandor Clegane's hand fell away from her arm. Fetch my sister, then, Robb said. Tyrion gestured to Jacelyn, who gestured to a runner, who sprinted up the inner steps. Cersei did not move. She watched the knot of men on the stair as if the world had narrowed to that one place. Her bottle ticked against her wrist again as she shifted. She imagined for an instant how it would feel to loose the stopper and press her son's mouth to death. That was a place she had kept for herself, a locked room. She did not open it now, not with so many eyes on her. Put up your swords, Robb said to his men without raising his voice. You do not strike unless struck. Mormont, hold the gatehouse. Umber, hold the yard. Blackwood. He did not finish because from the inner door of the keep a girl ran out in a plain dress with her hair braided in a simple tail, and the breath went out of him like the candle lanterns about the yard had all blown in the same gust. His sister. She did not look like the little girl who had chased cats in Winterfell's Godswood. She looked like a reed that had bent and somehow not broken. She moved down the steps as if each riser had been made for a different foot. She was not crying. She was not smiling. She was only alive in a body that looked like hers. Robb, she said when they were near enough that quiet could carry. He reached for her as if she were a thing remembered suddenly that he could not believe in. His hands touched her shoulders, her hair, as if to prove that the world still had weight. Gray wind breathed in her scent and set his head against her ribs like a child pressing in. Sansa's hands came up of their own accord to hold his wrists. They did not say anything else for a long moment that was only heart and breath. "Enough of this," Joffrey said. He picked up a crossbow from the hands of a quailing squire and leveled it over the balustrade. The arrow's head was a black seed. He had taken boar with such bolts before. He could take wolves. He could take whatever he wished if he said he wished it strongly enough. Sandor Clegane's hand closed around the bow and twisted without any gentleness. Something cracked. Joffrey's cry was ugly and high. Cersei whirled on the hound and saw nothing she could use in his burned face. Nothing to press or pull. It was like looking at a wall someone had painted a face on, and she'd misplaced her brush. "Sire," she said very quietly, "you forget yourself." "No," Sandor said. His voice sounded like boots on gravel. "I remember, little bird. Go." Sansa did not need telling twice. She moved down the last steps to her brother and was inside his men's ring before any hand could think to stop her. Tyrion watched the shape of the day change around that small motion. Watched it as a man watches the first eddies change around a rock before a river carves an island there. "Take her," Robb said to Brynden. "Mother is with the guard at the King's Gate. Get her there. If I fall, get her out of the city by any way you can. Do you hear me?" "I'm an old man," Brynden Tully said with the faintest lift at one corner of his mouth. "Not a stone." He put a hand on Sansa's back and moved with her through the press while men who knew his name simply made space because that is what you do when certain men pass. "Now," Tyrion said. "We can speak." "Later," Robb said. "You will gather the watch and lay down arms. You will put your swords in a pile there." He pointed. "We will lock them away. Your men will go to their barracks and sleep on their hands. If any man loots one crust from one baker's shelf, I will hang him myself. Do you understand me?" "I do," Jacelyn Bywater said. Something like respect passed through his voice in a rough rasp. It was possible to respect a boy who did not roar but who spoke in the voice of winter. In the city, the bells, once freed, could not be made to stop for a while. They swung and spoke, and with their speaking the small folk woke into confusion and then, slowly, into fear and then hope and then something like joy that they would be ashamed of later. Men and women opened shutters and watched gray men move along the streets where red had moved for too long. In the Street of Flower, the baker the boy knew stepped out to watch a column of northern spears pass and crossed herself without remembering which gods she had meant to invoke. By dawn, the direwolf flew over the red keep alongside the king's stag, a thing that some laughed at and some thought blasphemy. Robb had not meant to fly the stag, but Tyrion had suggested it, not because he loved anyone who had called himself Baratheon, but because symbolism, properly hammered, made good armor. The sight of the stag beside the wolf said to the city, "This is not sack, this is wardenship." It reminded the small who fed from rumors that the wolf had not come to sit where they imagined lions would always sit. "If you must take it clean," his mother had said. He kept repeating it under his breath. Catelyn Stark rode through the King's Gate just as sun touched the city's baked brick and oily slate. She had brought the reserve with her, river-run spears and 100 archers from Lord Piper, and the sight of her son alive on the steps of the Red Keep with his sister at his side pecked tears from her eyelids faster than any grief had ever done. He came down to meet her, and they touched foreheads together like they had when he was shorter than her hip. He smelled of iron and river. For a long breath, he was her boy again in a yard in the north with a wooden sword and a skinned knee. She let him be and then let him go. "You took it," she said in a voice that did not tremble. "We took it," he corrected gently, "and kept it cleaner than most men would," Brynden said behind her, "and if pride could have protected a woman from sorrow, she would have been proof." They gathered in the small council chamber with the chairs still warm from men who had fled or died. Varys had arrived before any of them, of course, and poured small beer into cups as if this were a morning like any other. Littlefinger was conspicuously absent. Long after, men would say that he had slipped away with half the city's coin in 3 chests disguised as flour sacks, but Tyrion doubted it. Peter Baelish liked to steal things you didn't notice were gone until your hand reached and found nothing and everyone was watching. "We will need to order bread," Tyrion said briskly before anyone could begin shouting. "There are granaries in the city, but the last months have not been gentle, and kindness shown to the bellies that growl today is worth 100 speeches tomorrow." "You are a prisoner," Catelyn reminded him coolly. "I'm a prisoner who knows where the bread is," he countered. "Use the bread, not the prisoner. Hang me later if that's your wish." Robb's mouth moved in what would have been a wry smile in the north, and here looked like a knife trying to learn to be merciful. "Let him work," he told his mother. "He knows the city, and betrays it when it suits him," Catelyn said. "It will suit him to keep living," Tyrion said. He lifted his cup to her. "And it will suit me to make certain the city is quiet, because a quiet city is one that does not drown me in a well." "You will not walk unguarded," Robb said. "If you help, I will keep you breathing. If you betray, I will close my hands." "Fair," Tyrion said, as if they were discussing rents. "Varys, you have a list? Of men who will not flee when asked to carry a loaf." "I have many lists," Varys said, and his smile was gentle as a soft bed. "Some of them even contain what they purport to." "Good," Robb said. He looked at the fat man, and Varys inclined his head as if he had been thanked for a small courtesy. "We'll need the pyromancers watched." "Oh yes," Tyrion said and rubbed at his face, where his beard rasped under his palm. "There are fires in this city which like to be coaxed, and others that like to run on their own legs. Best we don't have any of that." "Where is Joffrey?" Catelyn asked. "In a guest chamber with 2 guards at his door and a chamber pot," Brynden answered. "Cersei attempted to take him into Maegor's holdfast and close the causeway. Bywater got there first." "And the queen?" "In the Tower of the Hand," Tyrion said, very bland. "For now, I will recommend we secure her elsewhere. A room with a view of the Sept calms many women." Catelyn's look would have pierced plate. Robb placed a hand on the table and spoke before she could. "We will treat them as highborn prisoners ought to be treated. For now." Tyrion heard the words that were not said with ears that had sharpened themselves on other men's silences. "For now, until I must buy something with them. Until the war forces me to account for what they are worth." He did not blame the boy for it. The Iron Throne had taught him arithmetic he had never wanted to know. By afternoon, word had flown as ravens do, ahead of itself in changing shape as it goes. In Harrenhal's shadow, a messenger soaked with sweat knelt before Lord Tywin Lannister and held out a letter with a wolfswood scent on it. Tywin read the plain words once, then again, then a third time, and folded the paper as if it might crumble under anything more than a careful hand. He did not throw the table or condemn fools or call down the heavens. He dismissed the messenger, dismissed the cupbearer, dismissed even his maester, and stood alone in a hall built by a man who had loved to build too much. The wind moaned as if it had found words it could not hold. He put his hands behind his back and looked at nothing for a long time. They had moved under his nose. Not because he had not seen them, but because he had accounted for too many men like himself and too few men like the boy who called himself king in the north. That error would be corrected. If he could not correct it by steel, he would by coin, if not by coin then by men meaner than steel or coin. There are 100 ways to break a wolf that has taken a lion's house, and he would find the ones that did not require him to throw what remained of Lannisport's sons against stone for nothing. He called for a scribe then and composed 3 letters and then a 4th. One went to Lord Walder Frey and was written in that patient, deliberate hand Tywin used when offering a very small man a very large cup. One went to Peter Baelish wherever he had scuttled because rats kept their bargains better than knights. One went to Highgarden and used the word proposal 3 times and did not say once what the proposal was. The last went to his brother Kevin and contained only these words: "The boy has the city. Hold Jaime with your life. We will need him whole." On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon's jaw hardened as he read Davos Seaworth the same plain words. He stood with the night wind dragging at his cloak on the castle's high parapet. The sea was iron in the late light, and the sun bled behind low cloud. He had been a soldier for all his life and a claimant for months that had stretched like skin over hunger. He had thought of kings landing under his foot as a thing inevitable because law and right sometimes are inevitable if one leans hard enough. And now a northern boy had placed his boot there first. He did not shout. He never had. He only turned his eyes to Davos, who watched him with that calm, sad fisherman's look. "He does not claim it," Davos said. "He holds it. Beggaring little men of words, Lord. But there's a difference. Words are ships," Stannis said, "and the right ones carry armies. He holds it, and that is the thing that matters. If I sail into the Blackwater now, I do not take a city. I take a war with a boy who has already spiked his banners on its walls." "You could talk," Davos said. "You could make a bargain." "I do not bargain with thieves." Stannis's mouth wanted to sneer, but it did not know how. "He is as much a rebel as any. The North has raised another king. There is one throne. It is mine." Davos looked at him a long time without blinking. "There is also what a man wants for other men than himself. There is food. There are nights when the wind off the wall would skin you if you let it. You have spoken of law. The law of winter is harder than parchments. If you can't take the city, you can take something else worth having." Stannis said nothing for a time. He could hear his brother's laughter in the silence and hated it as he always had. "I will send you with terms," he said at last. "If the lad is too proud, he is nothing. If he is not, perhaps we carry something out of this that does not stink." Davos bowed as a man bows when he knows what he is putting his head into. "Aye." In the Red Keep, Sansa slept because her body demanded it, because it had been too long since it had been allowed to do the thing it was made to do. She slept with the window cracked and the air moving across her skin like a cool hand. In sleep, she saw the gods wood at Winterfell as it had been on the day the snows came early and Arya had made a castle of ice with walls that toppled when you laughed. She woke with tears on her cheeks and did not wipe them away. She walked into the morning with them there and found her mother on a bench in the shade of an old fig tree that had no business growing in a place where it snowed only for show. "Mother," Sansa said. "Daughter," Catelyn answered, and the word was a house rebuilt with a single beam. They did not embrace at once. They watched the leaves move and heard the city beyond the walls and let themselves be women who had been made thinner than they should have been and somehow did not break. "Will father's bones come north?" Sansa asked at last, and Catelyn's hands closed together in her lap so tight the knuckles went white. "Yes," Catelyn said. "I will have him. I will have him home." They spoke of small things then, the bread the Manderleys had brought, the way the Mormont women swore, the sound of the bells when they finally stopped, and did not speak for a time of men with letters in their pockets and promises in their mouths. A raven came with Stannis's seal 3 days later. It was carried into the council by a boy whose feet seemed not to touch the ground, and it was opened by Catelyn because she was the one whose hands did not shake. She read it, stilled, and passed it to her son. "Robb, read it twice. He will recognize our keeping the city until he arrives," Robb said. "He calls me your Grace of the North, and says he does not in that title concede the law. He will grant me my sisters, my dead father's bones, and a peace under law if I cede the city to him and bend the knee." Catelyn turned her face slightly. "He does not know you have Sansa already." "He pretends not to," Tyrion said. "It costs him nothing. It obliges you to think in his words. Do not." Robb set the parchment down with care. Across from him, Theon sprawled in a chair with his long legs out and a smile around his mouth that did not reach his eyes. "Well," Theon said lazily, "a king invites a king to a table. How many kings make a feast?" "Too many," Brynden murmured. Tyrion watched the boy. He called him boy in his head still because it made it easier to count how quickly he had not stayed one. Make the arithmetic. A northern crown that could be made true by the speaking of a stern man in the south. A city that had been taken like a trout lifted by bare hands from a stream. A war that would flood the street or that, depending on the angles of 3 or 4 decisions made in this room. "You should take it," Catelyn said. "You did not come to sit a southern chair." "I will not bend the knee," Robb said. The words were very quiet and had the weight of the wall in them. "Not to any southern throne." Not after all that has been taken. I will hold the city until Stannis comes to take it, and then I will give it to him." Tyrion's brows went up. "A gift that buys? Bread for my people, peace between our lands, my father's bones back to Winterfell, and a charter signed by his hand," Robb said. "The North will be the North. He will not give me a king's title on his paper. I do not need it. My own men call me what I am. I will have writ that the South will not march again above the neck without North's leave. I will have taxes agreed for trade through White Harbor. I will have," he stopped. "I will have something I can give to mothers whose sons went into the snows with me and did not come back." Tyrion sipped his ale and hid his smile. He wondered whether the stern man on Dragonstone would know which piece of his stubbornness to keep and which to sell. Davos Seaworth rode in under a flag of truce 2 days after the Raven. He was sun-touched and salt-scarred and looked at the city with a look that was half sailor and half father. He smelled the baked dust and the butcher's gutters and the sugar from the street vendors who had found their voice again, and he thought, "It is like any port, hungry with its mouth open." They met in the throne room because Robb insisted, because he wanted the walls to make a statement he would not make with his mouth. The Iron Throne had never looked to him like a thing a man gets taller by climbing. It looked like a punishment worked too long. He stood well away from it with gray wind at his heel and watched the Onion Knight kneel. "Lord," Davos said, squinting into more extravagance than any decent man could swallow easily. "My king sends greeting." "Rise," Robb said. "Bring his greeting with the terms you were given." Davos stood and did not fidget. He had spent too many hours in too many great rooms wondering where the trap was to start now. "His Grace, Stannis of House Baratheon, rightly king." He stopped when Robb's mouth didn't change. "Stannis says, you hold the city, I do not ask how. He asks it back. Give it, and he will say the North's lord heeds the law, and he will not march above the neck. He will write it, and what he writes he keeps. He asks for prisoners." Davos paused. "He will make examples of them. He will not pretend otherwise." "Joffrey," Robb said. Davos's lids lowered once. "Him. Cersei." Another pause, shorter. "If his law demands. My father's bones. I. And the girl. If you had her. But looks to me you do." Davos did not glance. Men who live long in rooms like these learn early to look only where they mean to put their next foot. Robb Stark's eyes moved past Davos to the throne. "I do not want it," he said softly to that thing of iron. "And if I took it, I could not keep it. I do not wish to learn to keep what I do not want by doing things I do not wish to do." "It does that to a man," Davos said dryly. "Makes him learn he's himself, or he isn't." "The North will be the North," Robb said to the Onion Knight. "Your king will write that his law ends at the neck unless my people invite it forward. He will write that no southern lord will press tax upon White Harbor beyond the agreed tithe. He will write words enough to hold a generation. Then I will put the keys of this keep in his hand with witnesses, and he may call himself whatever he likes to men who love such sounds." Davos tilted his head. "And the woman? She will go with him to his justice. I will not sit in judgment." Robb's mouth tightened. "Send this and tell him the city will hold for him 3 weeks and no more. I have other wars." "The West," Davos said simply. "And whatever comes from the sea," Robb said, and his eyes flicked to Theon as if he were checking that the knife was still in his belt. Theon only grinned. It was his old grin, but things had grown behind it. Davos's eyes warmed for a breath. "I'll take it." When Tyrell letters came, their paper smelled faintly of rose water and their phrases were all camp talk dressed in silk. Hospitality, mutual interest, marriage. They were addressed to everyone at once and no one especially, which was a trick of politeness. Olenna Redwine's hand was a needle through the words, even when others wielded the quill. Robb kept them and did not answer at once. He knew better than to give an old spider more strands. Meantime, he ruled a city he did not want. He walked the streets with a small guard and gray wind, and men began to look at him with the wary hope they gave a weather change. He had Fletchers set to work in the Street of Steel making arrows in sizes the City Watch could handle. He had the potters set 100 great jars aside in case of siege, and paid them with coin White Harbor had brought in casks. He stood by as Tywin taught him the names of men who could be bought for bread, and those who could not be bought at all, and the more dangerous class, those who could be bought for something better than bread, which might be pride. He put a guard on the alchemist's guild house. He walked the underways of the Red Keep with Varys until he felt like a boy being led by the hand through a story he did not fully trust. He stood in the September of Baelor with his mother and Sansa and watched a woman light 7 candles and speak words to 7 faces, and he did not pray, because a wolf has gods that do not like marble rooms. He thought of snow instead and the clack of ravens. On the 4th day, a sellsword with a pebble's eyes tried to put a crossbow bolt in Robb's back in the market, and missed by a hand's breadth because grey wind turned his head at a fly and the movement spoiled the man's aim. Blackfish took the bolt out of the plaster, held it up to the light, and then held it in his palm as if it were a bird cupped there. "You will not do better than luck forever," Brynden said mildly. "Someone hired him. Someone will hire another." "Tywin," Catelyn said. "Or the man who wishes to become Tywin," Tyrion said thoughtfully. "Peter would not waste a good notion like you on random chance. He would stack his fires." They found the man in a cellar under the Street of Sisters where a wine merchant kept casks sweet enough to make a Septon smile. He had cut his own throat with a shard of dark glass, or someone had done it for him in a hurry. Theon looked down at him and thought of his father's hands on a tiller and of Robb's hand on his shoulder, and felt the pull and counterpull so sharply he laughed to hear his own voice. Robb gave the city back to Stannis on a morning when the heat had not yet risen rich from stone, when the smell of seaweed and tar still had a cutting freshness to it. They did it in the throne room because men needed rooms larger than themselves to believe themselves. The Tyrells sent 2 witnesses and kept their rosewater smiles to themselves. Davos stood on his king's right, Catelyn on her son's. Sansa stood behind her mother with her hands folded, and when Joffrey was brought in under guard to see the thing he could not understand, he swallowed so hard his throat bobbed like a trapped bird. Cersei's mouth was a thin white seam. Robb Stark did not kneel because he had said he would not, and Stannis Baratheon did not demand it, because Davos had told him a truth he could use. Robb drew keys from his belt and held them in both hands like a man holding a bowl of water. They talked then, the 2 of them, in front of men who would make their words larger or smaller than they were. And what they said was this: "I take a city not yours," Stannis said. "You held it, and I mark that you did not despoil it. I will judge those who would have burned it. I will write what I have been asked to write. I give you a city I do not want," Robb said. "I will take my sister and my dead and my men, and you will not follow me past the neck without leave. You will hold your men to law and not to joy. You will hang looters as I do." They made a document then with language that smelled of damp vellum and iron gall ink. Stannis signed with his full styling. Robb signed with his, which did not include any words south of winter. Tyrion, at Robb's shoulder, scrawled his name under both and later laughed to himself about it. A dwarf's joke on scribes who would spend their lives parsing lines that had been drawn by men who could not be parsed. When it was done, Robb stepped away from the throne and felt not lighter, because crowns and choices do not weigh less when you put them down, but clearer, as if a line had been drawn beneath a column of figures and the answer had been found, even if it did not please. He looked at Sansa and saw a girl who had stood up again after being made to kneel. He thought of Arya and the way she ran, and of Bran's dreams and Rickon's fierce, small hands, and of a father under Winterstone and a mother who had taught him to take a city clean, and a wolf who would one day die because all things do. He thought of the West and men who did not forgive, and of the sea, and an old man with a crown of rough iron he would never wear. They left that day by the King's Gate under banners that had already begun to gather soot and grime from the city's breath. Grey wind trotted with his head low, tongue lolling a little, and men's eyes followed him with something like awe and something like fear. Theon rode close to Robb and said nothing. When they reached the edge of the city, Sansa turned and looked back once. A long look, as if she were counting the windows that had looked at her like eyes and the stones that had pressed against her soles. She did not bless the place. She did not curse it. She only looked and then turned her horse to the road north. Behind them, in the Red Keep's cool rooms, Cersei Lannister laughed once. a bright chime of sound like a drop of mercury on stone, and then went very still. Joffrey kicked at nothing with his sharp little heels. Pycelle dozed and dreamed of girls who had never looked at him. On Dragonstone, Stannis had a pyromancer hung and watched his feet drum and said nothing. In Harrenhal, Tywin Lannister read a new letter, and in the press of his mouth there was a warning some other man would not have seen. Lord Walder Frey held Tywin's letter to the light as if there might be gold dust worked into the fibers. He could smell roast capon on the air and the rank, sweet smell of river mud and his own old man's piss. He smiled with only the left side of his mouth. He had the sense of something at once grand and petty happening beyond his walls, the way a man knows when his neighbors are feuding, though he cannot say over what. He licked his lips and sent for his dull-witted son. "Robb Stark keeps his vows," the son said stupidly to something else hours later, and Walder hit him with a sugar plum. "We will see," he said to the air. On the far side of all of them, in the north where sky takes the whole of the eye and snow eats sound, a great wall of ice stood as it always had, and the cold walked, patient and old. Ravens leaped into the air with black wings and went south in knots that anyone might have read if they had thought to. Jon Snow, riding back from the skirling dark of the Skirling Pass with Ghost a pale shadow at his stirrup, lifted his face into a wind that had the taste of distances men had forgotten. He did not know what had been done in the south. He would hear. He would make of that news something he could use or something that would break his heart. For now the snow began, and he pulled his cloak closer and said nothing. The world's breath had changed. He could feel it in the hairs on the back of his neck. He thought of his brothers and of a boy who had been his brother once. They rode north with the smell of the city slowly washing from their cloaks. The fields on either side of the road lay pale and dry under the late summer sun, the wheat not yet taken. Catelyn watched men harvest in silence with their shirts off and their children yawning in the margins, and had to press her hand to her chest to keep from sobbing at the sight, because it was ordinary, and ordinary was a richer thing than any lord could write. Brynden rode ahead with a scout's patience. Sansa rode in the heart of the column and slept in the saddle sometimes because her body had made a list and was checking it against the things it had been denied. Robb did not look back. If he looked back, he would see a city whose walls would draw those who loved walls and rooms where cunning slept lightly. He would see his own shadow on those stones, and he would resent it. He did not need that kind of looking. He needed the road and the smell of horses and the maps blackening under his hand. At the ford of the Red Fork, he gathered his lords and put his finger on the parchment where Tywin's host sat. "He will not move quickly," Robb said. "He will coil. He will sting when he thinks we have our eyes on something else. He will send men we don't see and coin we don't feel until the thing he wants to move moves of its own accord. We will not move as he wishes. We will not present him a throat. You say when to bite," Great John grunted, and a ripple of rough amusement went through the ring of men because it was a thing that sounded like the world they understood. Theon lifted an eyebrow like a challenge and did not voice it. At night, he wrote a letter to a father he did not know how to speak to and then burned it. He dreamed of a shore and a boy with salt in his hair laughing because he did not know yet that laughter could be made into a thing to punish. He woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth and could not say whose home had burned. Catelyn watched her son talk and eat and fall into exhausted sleep with his boots still on, and thought of the day she had put his hand on a wooden sword and told him not to hit first but to hit true. She thought of a city whose bells still rang in her ears like a ghost, and of snow and the river and the sea, and the way a woman sits with a body that is not warm any longer and thinks, "I am still here." She slept less and spoke more to the gods, even those who did not recognize her voice. In King's Landing, Stannis held court with a hardness that felt to the small, as if they had traded a lion's careless claw for a cold pin that fixed them to a board. He hanged 3 men that week, 2 looters and a pyromancer whose eyes had been wrong too long, and added a column to his ledgers that accounted for bread given into the hands of women whose men were not in the city anymore to give them bread. Tyrion was permitted to live. He was not given title. He did not ask for one. He walked freer than he had expected to. He stood one day in the gallery and looked down at the Iron Throne and thought, "It is a chair made of 100 men's fear of failure. Then he went and found Bronn and lost a dice deliberately to a mother with 5 children who wanted to watch a small man lose because it made her smile in a way that cost him only coin. Varys sat very still in his chamber and wrote 3 letters and tied each with thread drawn from 3 different cuffs of 3 different robes. And when the candle guttered, he pinched it out with a moistened finger and sat in the dark, very pleased with the way small men had made great men move like fingers on a board. He did not believe he served any man who had signed paper that week. He served the thing that was not a man at all, something like a long breath held under water that would surface when it could. Tywin Lannister set his own board with the knowledge of a man who has seen too many boards cleared by men who move too quickly. He did not speak often, and when he did it was almost always to ask a question. When a raven came from the Isles with nothing in it but a twist of salt-stained paper and a line in a harsh, cramping hand that said, "The sea does not ask permission," he smiled once with a baring of teeth that did not mean delight. Winter kept its counsel. The sky went higher with the passing days, the air clearer, the world sharper. The stories men would tell about the night the wolves came out of the river had already begun to grow tales of their own. In the child's version, the gray wolf had leaped to the throne and stolen a blade from its back. In the drunk's version, the boy king had knelt and begged and been given sweetmeats and sent to bed. In the version that mothers told to make their children sleep, a quiet boy had gone into a terrible house and not woken the fire because he knew the cost of waking. On a height not far from the sea, where a road winds up and a wind never stops moving, Robb Stark stood with gray wind and watched a hawk make circles in a blue so deep it had its own weight. He felt the road going out ahead of him like another kind of river. He had not yet paid all that he would pay for what he had done. He knew it. He did not flinch from the knowing. He thought of his father and said his name in his head and did not ask for forgiveness because the dead do not part with things so easily. He asked for steadiness instead, and for men who would not break when he asked too much of them. Gray wind lifted his head, sniffed the wind, and huffed. Robb scratched the wolf behind the ear. "Hush," he said gently. "We have further to go." In King's Landing the bells waited to be rung again, as bells do. In the west, coin changed hands in quiet rooms and knives found rooms where no one had cleaned up after the last dinner. In the north, a word like a footfall came south with the sharpness of ice. In between them all, little lives went on. A baker's boy kneaded dough with brown arms and thought of wolves and became, for an hour, quieter than he had ever been. A girl brushed her mother's hair in a slum beside the river and sang a song that had no words because words were a luxury. The story had turned, and that was only the first turn. Men like to think they make clean endings for themselves. The world likes to make them keep walking.